My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time.
Liberation Day has finally arrived, but it's not some grandiose celebration of US freedom, at least not in any traditional sense. US President Donald Trump has instead used his self-coined day to make a huge announcement. It's now the US versus the world in a massive trade war.
April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple, can't get any simpler than that.
Trump has hit out at almost every country in the world with what he claims to be reciprocal tariffs, and the fallout will impact everyone around the globe. At the White House on April 2nd, Trump stood in the Rose Garden to announce that he was going to step up the global trade war that he's already sparked with his initial batches of tariffs. How? By declaring a national economic emergency that he says has forced him to announce tariffs of at least 10%, and often more, that applies to every country outside the US. It gets worse for the 60 countries on Trump's list as the worst offenders when it comes to US trade, according to Trump. Some of those countries will be hit with tariffs bordering on 50%. Among the heaviest hits was China. Already subject to a 20% tariff, China now has an additional 34% tariff on almost every good or service that comes out of the country, leaving it dealing with a tariff rate of 54%. Other countries that Trump hit hard with the announcement include Vietnam, which has a 46% tariff applied to it, the countries of the European Union or EU, which now has to deal with a 20% tariff rate, and Cambodia, to which Trump has applied a 49% rate. Cambodia may seem like an odd choice of nation for Trump to target. To most Americans, the country may seem to have very little impact on the average person's life. However, digging into the numbers show a bit of Trump's supposed rationale. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, total goods trade between the US and Cambodia amounted to $13 billion in 2024. However, that trade was lopsided. The US exported just $321.6 million of that $13 billion total, with US good imports from Cambodia hitting $12.7 billion. That imbalance lies at the heart of most of Trump's higher tariffs. He's hitting the countries that sell far more to the US than they buy from, and Cambodia, in Trump's mind, is one of the worst offenders. However, China is the headline recipient of Trump's new tariffs, not least because Donald decided to go further with them than almost any other country. Not only is Trump sending total Chinese tariffs up to 54%, he announced that his tariff rate will also apply to any packages worth less than $800 that arrive in the US from China. Why does that matter? Well, when was the last time you enjoyed a Shine haul? Perhaps you're ordering a lot of cheap Chinese products from Temu, AliExpress or Wish. If you fall into any of those categories, those cheap products you've been buying are now going to cost you 54% more than they did in the past. Or more accurately, the companies that sell those products have to pay 54% more to get them to you, which is a cost they will almost inevitably pass on to their consumers. Other nations that Trump hit hard with his tariffs were among those what Washington dubbed the Dirty 15. According to The Independent, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent didn't name any of these countries before Trump made his tariff announcement. Instead, he said that the Dirty 15 is a list of countries that not only trade heavily with the US, but also apply their own high tariffs to goods they import from the US. There are also countries that create other barriers to US goods crossing their borders, such as applying domestic content production rules. It's also not 15 nations in the Dirty 15. Rather, it's the 15% of countries that account for the majority of America's trading volume. Before Trump's Liberation Day, Bessent hinted at what those nations will face. What's going to happen on April 2nd? Each country will receive a number that we believe represents their tariffs, Bessent told reporters. For some countries, it could be quite low. For some countries, it could be quite high. Then there's what we would call kind of the Dirty 15, and they have substantial tariffs. Most of the Dirty 15 were economies that have the largest trade deficits in goods with the United States. That explains why Cambodia was hit so hard. However, nations like Brazil, China, India, Vietnam, and the UK were on the list. The same goes for China and the European Union, which we now know were among the hardest hit by Trump's tariffs. Of course, Trump's move leaves us with a ton of questions. The most obvious one is simple. How did Trump and his team arrive at the numbers they've shared? Trump offered some hints when making his announcement. He told the world that goods that are already subject to sector-wide tariffs, such as aluminum, steel, and vehicles, won't fall victim to his reciprocal tariffs. That is, unless any of those products come from China, in which case the 34% tariff applied on April 2nd will add to the 20% tariff already applied to those sectors. It's all so confusing. However, Trump's clue to how the US calculated its numbers comes from the term reciprocal. Trump asserts that his new tariffs are around half of the tariff rate the US claims other countries already applied to its goods and services. Those tariffs often aren't as direct as the ones the US implements, Trump claims. Instead, they were calculated by taking into account other trade barriers, such as domestic content production rules mentioned earlier, and what the US deems currency manipulation designed to lower the value of goods and services exported from the US. However, the biggest indicator of America's calculation method comes from the massive list of reciprocal tariffs the White House published in the wake of Trump's announcement. For each nation, the US has come up with a figure that it claims represents a tariff applied to it by that nation. For instance, China's supposed tariffs charged to the US are at 67% when taking direct tariffs, trade barriers, and currency manipulation into account. The EU's rate is 39%, while Vietnam, which was hit with one of Trump's highest tariffs, apparently has a 90% tariff levied against the US. Next to these rates are the US figures, which are roughly half the supposed tariffs other countries are levying against the US. But that's about all we know, and critics have called into question how Trump's team even calculated these rates in the first place. To the countries that Trump has hit hardest, these rudimentary calculations will seem like they've been pulled out of thin air to justify Trump's decisions. The one thing we know for certain is that Trump has just sparked a global trade war, the likes of which we've never seen. Which brings us to our next question. What impact will these sweeping tariffs have? Trump paints a rosy picture, at least for the US. When announcing the tariffs, the US president claimed his sweeping measures are going to give us growth because they allow the US government to no longer have to rely so heavily on income taxes as a source of revenue. In 2024 alone, the US government generated about $2.4 trillion in revenue from individual income taxes, amounting to around 49% of the $4.9 trillion the federal government collected. That averages out to taxes of around $14,600 per person, with Trump seeming to imply that this average will fall dramatically now that he has his global tariffs in place. He's even gone as far as to claim his tariffs could lead to the abolishment of the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, with tariffs replacing the money the IRS previously generated for the US government. The problem with that approach, as Apollo Global Management chief economist Torsten Slok pointed out when Trump made those IRS replacement claims in February, is that tariffs would have to be massive to have that sort of impact. Slok suggested a rate of at least 100% on all imported goods, meaning Trump's latest batch of extreme tariffs may not even be high enough. And even if Trump follows up on Liberation Day by implementing even more tariffs, it still may not be enough. As Slok points out, every Econ 101 class ever delivered teaches the basic of supply and demand. When prices rise, demand trails off. Tariffs lead to companies charging higher prices because the goods they're importing to sell to American citizens cost more. The challenge is that it's unclear what will happen to sales if all imported products double in price, Slok said in a letter penned to his company's investors. Given higher prices result in lower sales, it may require as much as 200% tariffs on all imported goods for the total tariff revenue to replace income taxes. Slok's implication here is simple. As tariffs rise, so does inflation. The average American now faces a situation where they'll have to pay much more for any product that's made using even a small amount of goods imported from overseas. That means the more likely reality of Trump's latest tariff announcements, both for the US and every country it just hit with tariffs, is uncertainty. The level of that uncertainty is showcased in a BBC article that attempts to describe what the impact of Trump's tariffs will be in the UK. That country was among the least affected by Liberation Day, having only a 10% tariff applied to its goods in retaliation for a supposed 10% tariff it levies against the US. It seems that the 10% rate was the baseline for any country implementing tariffs, but the impact will still be felt in the UK. Prices could rise or they could fall, says the BBC. It's hard to tell. The initial rises will likely be felt by US consumers as other nations hike their prices. However, the amount people pay in other countries could be affected by the turmoil Trump's announcements have caused to currency exchange. For instance, the US dollar to British pound rate rose from $1.29 per pound to $1.31 in the aftermath of Trump's announcement. That change means that individuals and companies in the UK that receive payments in US dollars now have less money than they did just a day ago. However, those who buy in US dollars may now get a little more bang for their buck. Trump's tariffs could affect millions of jobs worldwide too, especially in companies that specialize in exporting goods to the United States. Again, using the UK as an example, it sold around $78.39 billion of goods to the US in 2024. Many of the businesses that contributed to that figure could decide to pull back on sales, especially if they can't absorb the tariffs. In the UK alone, a separate 25% tariff being applied to its vehicle manufacturing sector apparently places 25,000 jobs in the country at risk. And all of this is just in the UK. Taken globally, Trump's latest tariffs are going to create a lot of anger and resentment among the US's biggest trading partners. But the most immediate impacts will likely be felt by the US itself. In its analysis of the key takeaways from Trump's Liberation Day announcement, CNN says that the US businesses are going to have to brace for a fallout. The higher costs now placed on US-based importers are either going to have to be absorbed by those American businesses or passed on to consumers. Devil's Foot Brewing president Benjamin Colvin summed up the mood when speaking at a news conference among business owners in North Carolina. "It's concerning," said Colvin. "It's going to be expensive. It's going to require us all to make decisions." In Colvin's case, Trump's previous tariffs on steel and aluminum have already seen his business costs skyrocket. Other businesses that will be affected include grocery stores, which often import food from overseas. "Our food system is intricately linked with global markets," said Food Industry Association President Leslie Saracen. That includes products not grown in the United States like bananas or seasonal items, which helps keep prices down while providing American shoppers year-round access to safe, nutritious foods. She's essentially saying that these types of imported foods may no longer be available to Americans at affordable prices. On a wider level, the impact Trump's tariffs have on these types of importing businesses will likely lead to a lot of job losses in the US. Importing companies will have to shrink, either because they're trying to absorb new costs or they're passing those costs on to consumers and thus reducing their own sales. Back in 2021, in the aftermath of Trump's initial tariff-based war with China, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace said the US economy lost nearly 250,000 jobs. And many more may soon be lost with Trump's new tariffs. US investors have also felt the sting of Trump's announcement. Stocks plummeted across the board, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropping 1,150 points when the market opened on April 3rd. Major US companies, including Walmart, Apple and Nike, saw their stock prices plummet. It's not quite a stock market crash, but these reactions show that investors are cautious at best and outright fearful at worst. Wedbush Securities senior analyst summed up the mood on Wall Street best when he said President Trump just finished his tariff speech at the White House, and we would characterize this slate of tariffs as worse than the worst case scenario. In other words, not even the most skeptical of investors saw this coming, and many are now acting to preserve their money as best they can. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries was far more damning in his appraisal of Trump's actions. "Republicans are crushing the American economy in real time and driving us to a recession," said Jeffries. "This is not Liberation Day, it's Recession Day." And that's the irony of Trump's trade war. Though the US president is trying to punish other nations for trade slights, the reality may be that the US could be hit the hardest of all. That's especially the case if the countries Trump has targeted respond with their own new tariffs. His administration says that the new US tariffs are just half of those being applied to it, meaning it would argue that other countries have no grounds to implement new tariffs of their own. But they could, and if they do, a model produced by The Conversation shows that retaliatory tariffs to the US's reciprocal tariffs could hit the US hard. According to the outlet's models, if other countries respond to the US in kind, the US stands to lose around $438.4 billion, which accounts for 1.45% of its gross domestic product, or GDP. In real terms, that would mean the average US household has $3,487 less than it does right now. By contrast, the only nations that could be impacted worse than the US in this scenario are Canada and Mexico, which face 1.65% and 2.24% declines in GDP respectively. Some nations might even end up better off. For instance, if the EU strikes back with a 20% tariff on US goods, its GDP will rise by 0.05%, placing an extra $53 per year into the pockets of the bloc's citizens. Still, Trump might argue it's not all bad news. Some products are exempt from his latest round of tariffs. For instance, goods arriving from Canada and Mexico that meet the conditions set forth by the United States-Canada-Mexico agreement Trump signed during his first term are exempt from this latest volley of tariffs. But that will be little solace to the countries that Trump has just hit so hard. And if the conversation modelling is correct, the US stands to face a massive backlash if those countries retaliate. The question now becomes simple. Will they? Here's Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on CNN.
And if countries retaliate, which some have said that they would, some have said they wanted to wait and see, what is the White House's response going to be to those countries?
Well, Caitlin, one of the messages that I'd like to get out tonight is everybody sit back, take a deep breath, don't immediately retaliate. Let's see where this goes, because if you retaliate, that's how we get escalation.
Bessent didn't outright say it, but he's implying that the US will levy more tariffs if any nation that it's just hit responds with tariffs of its own. None of those retaliatory tariffs have been implemented yet, but in the meantime, practically every nation affected is currently figuring out what it's going to do in response. Norway's Minister of Trade and Industry, Cecilie Myrseth, says, "We're doing calculations and looking through what has come." The European Commission head, Ursula von der Leyen, has already put Trump on notice a day before his announcement, as she claimed the EU has a strong plan for striking back against any tariffs he implements. Now that Trump has announced a 20% tariff on the EU, it's easy to imagine that a similar tariff will be sent back in his direction. Elsewhere, the tariffs are causing unexpected alliances to spring up. China, Japan and South Korea announced that they would jointly respond to Trump's tariffs 2 days before he announced them. That's unprecedented. In the current geopolitical climate, China is an enemy of Japan and South Korea. The fact that those three nations are combining forces to respond to Trump demonstrates just how much of a dent the US tariffs create in its relationships with allies like Japan and South Korea. It's worth noting that China has already promised firm countermeasures to Trump's tariffs, though it hasn't said what they will be. We can assume that whatever China does in response will be mirrored by its new economic partners, Japan and South Korea. Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin has called Trump's new tariffs bad for the world economy, while saying he sees no justification for the US decision. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk is already calling for real and true reciprocal tariffs, and the general attitude in Europe seems to be that everybody loses, but the EU can't afford not to retaliate against what the US is doing. It seems that Bessent's words are falling on deaf ears. The rest of the world isn't going to sit back and wait. It's certainly not going to allow the US to run roughshod with tariffs while offering no response. But perhaps that's what Trump and his team are looking for. After all, Trump's goal with all of this seems to be to create more jobs inside the US by essentially forcing companies to give up on importing goods from other nations. If those nations he's just hit hard with tariffs respond in kind, that justifies him to levy even more tariffs. And so it will continue, a vicious cycle that locks the US into a trade war with the rest of the world. Perhaps that cycle could push the US closer to the 100% plus tariffs Torsten Slok says would be needed to replace revenue generated via income tax in the federal budget. But for now, the entire world is in economic turmoil as we await more responses to Trump's Liberation Day. What do you think the long-reaching impact of Trump's new tariffs will be? Is the US set to face global retaliation, or will reciprocal tariffs be limited to some nations while others simply try to survive? How do you see these announcements affecting US alliances around the globe? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for up-to-date commentary on the latest global trade developments.